Here's a Venn diagram of people who are familiar with Vaporwave, the music genre, and Unicode, the text encoding standard. And this video is an in-depth analysis of here. For those of you who are here, or here, real quick. Vaporwave is a music genre. Well, actually, it's more than a music genre, but for the time being, let's just call it a music genre that samples things from the 80s and 90s. Not just music, but also things like the Weather Channel, video games, television ads,
beauty like Avon,
to play with ideas around nostalgia, memory, lost futures, and maybe that's a little oversimplified, but it's a good starting point. There's a whole visual side to it, and we'll get to that. Unicode is the text encoding standard that modern technologies use to represent text. Not just English letters, but also Spanish, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Vietnamese, Thai, Cherokee, dead languages like Phoenician, and super modern symbols like emojis. Unicode's goal is to represent every text character in every language with a code. So, within the world of Vaporwave, track titles, album titles, artist names. Sometimes Vaporwave artists will use these super wide full-width characters, or Japanese characters, or trademark symbols, or strange characters like these, or they'll format things to look like file names. You get the idea. So in this video, we're going to focus on where written text, but especially Unicode and Vaporwave overlap. And there are a lot of really interesting insights here because we can analyze text very differently than one might analyze music or visual art. The linguist Gretchen McCulloch wrote this book called Because Internet, which breaks down how the internet is changing the ways that the English language is being used. In the intro, she compares the challenges of analyzing speech and non-digitized writing, which is how linguists used to do things, with the ease of analyzing internet writing, where everything is public and digitized. McCulloch says that internet linguistics brings new insights to classic linguistic questions. And I think the same logic applies to Vaporwave. Lots of folks have broken down the music and visuals of Vaporwave in academic papers and on podcasts and YouTube and Reddit, but we're going to focus on the text. And in focusing on the text, we get data, and we can use that data to see not only how Vaporwave is different from other similar sounding styles of music, but also how Vaporwave has evolved and mutated over time. And we can even take a stab at where it's headed next. To pull off this analysis, I wrote code to scrape text that accompanied over 800,000 tracks from Bandcamp and SoundCloud, dating all the way back to 2010, and then wrote more code to analyze that text and pulled in some more data from Reddit and Google for good measure. So here, we can see how track count in the Vaporwave genre grew over time, then decreased, how Google searches for Vaporwave grew, then decreased, and the same with activity on the Vaporwave and Vaporwave aesthetic subreddits. But, as you'll soon see, this only tells us part of the story. By analyzing the text characters used alongside the music, we can see things like when the genre started drifting from its founding philosophies, when the visual side of Vaporwave started to overtake the musical side, when the genre embraced a spirit of experimentation, and when things got formulaic. So Vaporwave to me seems crafted to elicit this feeling that isn't quite just nostalgia. It's also related to dream states and decay and longing for times that may not ever have existed, and also longing for this sort of utopian future that we were promised back in the 80s and 90s but never arrived. And there are others who see Vaporwave differently. Some people call it an ironic meme and leave it at that. Some people interpret Vaporwave as a serious critique of capitalism, and it can be all of or none of these things. The music doesn't simply sample sounds from the 80s and 90s, but it also processes them to sound like they're being played from degraded VHS tapes, distant shopping malls, and faded memories, and the listener is often left with an almost warm, fuzzy feeling. The visual art intertwines things like vintage computer graphics, pop culture references, pink and teal gradients, corporate jargon.
The power of legitimacy.
Malls, skylines, Greek busts, and Japanese. And like the music, the imagery is often glitched and decayed to amplify these feelings of nostalgia, dream states, and lost futures. Now, not all Vaporwave text gets crazy with Unicode. Sometimes written word is simply paired with recorded sound to elicit these feelings. Some examples, and by the way, these are probably the only tracks in this video that I'm going to be able to properly read out loud. Okinawa Sunset. Ocean Beach High School Prom 1984. Condominium Living. We apologize for the inconvenience. A statistically significant number of Vaporwave tracks look very different. Take, for example, this. Text like this is unsettling because it's unpronounceable. If you're listening on shuffle, this sort of track can just pop up and then disappear. It can't be typed from memory. There's this article from Scientific American that describes how many of us experience text in dreams. Lots of people find they can't read text in a dream, that if they see text, it's almost always garbled or hieroglyphics, or it doesn't make sense, or it's fuzzy. Tracks like this elicit these same sorts of dreamlike feelings. So, before we go deeper into how Vaporwave uses some of these other Unicode characters, let's talk about Unicode itself. Like I mentioned earlier, Unicode is a text encoding standard whose goal is to assign every letter, number, and symbol in every language in the universe with a code. Unicode is what our phones and computers all use under the hood to represent text. There are currently about 150,000 Unicode characters, and they're organized into things called blocks. So, lowercase v is code 0076, and it's in the basic Latin block. The sunglasses emoji is code 1F60E, and it's in the emoticons block, and the infinity symbol, code 221E, is in the mathematical operators block. As you might imagine, most music genres use characters from the basic Latin block. This includes English and most European languages. Let's see how Vaporwave is different. Most Vaporwave tracks do contain characters from the basic Latin block, but those exist alongside other blocks. Aside from basic Latin, the most common blocks used in Vaporwave tracks are the CJK Unified Ideographs block. CJK stands for Chinese, Japanese, Korean, followed by Hiragana and Katakana blocks, which are both systems of Japanese writing, and Halfwidth and Fullwidth forms. These are those stretched out letters we saw earlier. Here are some examples of tracks that make use of Vaporwave's most common Unicode blocks. We'll talk a little bit more about why CJK and Fullwidth are so prevalent in Vaporwave in a sec, but I think it'd be useful to compare how Vaporwave uses Unicode with synthwave, Vaporwave's closest musical cousin. Musicians can straddle Vaporwave and synthwave designations, and the sounds of these two genres can sometimes overlap, but they're very different. The Aesthetics Wiki describes how Vaporwave is more tongue-in-cheek and sarcastic, while synthwave earnestly loves the 80s. Synthwave is made in tribute to the era, rather than critiquing it. And to quote from some Reddit users, Vaporwave is generally lighter colors, old computers, capitalism, and Greco-Roman statues. Synthwave is more neon, dark, sports cars, and Tron grids. Synthwave is designed to emulate classic 80s themes involving fast cars, women, and Miami sunsets, while Vaporwave is designed to evoke a sense of familiarity with the 80s, but in a more nightmarish sense. Let's take a look at how each genre uses the Unicode blocks we've been talking about. Here's how often Vaporwave uses CJK and Fullwidth characters, maybe 10 to 20% of the time. And here's how often Synthwave uses those same blocks. Basically, never. What about other Unicode blocks? Again, here's that long tail of Vaporwave's most used Unicode blocks. And here's Synthwave. Most Synthwave just uses basic Latin, Latin 1 supplement, and the Cyrillic block. Vaporwave is also more likely to mix and match characters from multiple blocks. Again, compared with Synthwave. And while it's rare to see a track that uses characters from 6 or more Unicode blocks, they do exist, and here are a few examples. Unicode hasn't always been the de facto standard. In the 80s and 90s, the decades that most influenced Vaporwave, there was no single accepted text encoding standard. Let's digress for a second to talk about Windows 95, the darling operating system of Vaporwave. Forbes magazine called Windows 95 the most important operating system of all time. Compared to its predecessor, Windows 3.1, it was like using something from the future. Windows 95 makes countless appearances in Vaporwave. Its startup sound is famously sampled on Blank Banshee Zero, an album that Fader called a definitive document of the Vaporwave era. It appears in multiple album titles. Album covers. Artist names. The Windows 95 logo even makes an appearance on the Vaporwave Wikipedia page. Why is this? Reddit user WarpCrow credits the dated corporate aesthetic and Microsoft's idealistic marketing. So, did Windows 95, Vaporwave's darling OS, use Unicode? No, it used ANSI. The Apple IIgs used ASCII. Mac computers prior to OS X used an encoding based off of ASCII called Mac OS Roman. Meanwhile, in Japan, text was encoded with one of the many JIS standards, JIS X0201, JIS X0208, Shift JIS. The default character set for older versions of HTML was ISO 88859 and so on. All of these technologies eventually adopted Unicode, but not before things got messy. In the 90s, when MP3s started to gain popularity, music wasn't accessed from centralized things like the iTunes Music Store or Spotify. Music was ripped, uploaded, tagged, downloaded, and burned to CD over and over again across systems with no agreed-upon text encoding standard, and Mojibake was a common occurrence. Some Vaporwave tracks seem to nod to this garbled text in their track titles. Among all the text encoding standards that were in use before Unicode, it's the Japanese ones that really left their mark on Vaporwave. Characters from the Japanese encoding standards eventually got their own Unicode block, and today, Vaporwave artists make heavy use of these blocks. It's time to talk about why Japan. In the 80s, Japanese companies like Nintendo, Sony, Fuji, Honda were starting to dominate global markets. In the US, there was a growing sense of admiration for Japanese technology and innovation, and Vaporwave is all about nostalgia for the 80s and 90s, so it's impossible to look back on the cars, TVs, camcorders, video games, computers of the time without thinking about Japan. Japanese technology from the 80s made an especially big mark on music and culture. The Roland TR-808 drum machine was invented in Japan in 1980, and without the TR-808, there'd be no hip-hop, no techno, no house music. The Discman, the world's first portable CD player, was invented in Japan in 1984. The Walkman, an invention which changed the way we listen to music, was invented in Japan 5 years earlier. In the 80s and 90s, when record stores were at their height of popularity, CDs imported from Japan were super desirable. Other Asian countries also left their marks. While the first boombox was invented by the Dutch brand Philips, the Dutch didn't produce the boomboxes that seeped their way into hip-hop videos. The Dutch didn't produce the boombox that John Cusack held over his head playing Peter Gabriel in the 1989 film Say Anything. John Cusack's boombox was a Japanese-made Toshiba RTSX-1. And of the 3 boomboxes in the Smithsonian Institute's collection, 1 is Japanese and 2 are Korean. So it's no surprise that Asian text in Vaporwave, especially Japanese text, can evoke a nostalgia for the 80s and 90s. When paired with Vaporwave music, Japanese text can transport us back to a time when, as Caliber Mag put it, Japan was the country that was building the future, one that looked shiny, new, and full of promise. Now, there's a lot of discussion around whether Vaporwave is guilty of cultural appropriation or worse, and the answer to this sort of thing isn't in the data, but discussing Japan's influence on Vaporwave without at least surfacing these ideas didn't feel right. The Bandcamp blog mentions that Vaporwave's dependence on Asian characters can be seen as coming dangerously close to fetishizing the other. And in a Reddit thread titled "Is Vaporwave Racist?", one comment argues that even if Vaporwave isn't racist, meaning it doesn't imply beliefs about cultural superiority, it is Orientalist, meaning it does reinforce some stereotypes and prejudices. Even if the answers to these questions can't be gleaned from our analysis, I think it's still worth bringing up. Let me know what you think. These stretched out characters that we often see in Vaporwave, sometimes accompanied by CJK characters and sometimes on their own, are called Fullwidth characters. We see them on tracks like These characters were introduced in the JISX 0201 standard in 1969 and have been used in print and digital media long before Unicode. JISX 0201 included 96 katakana characters and 96 ASCII characters, including Latin uppercase and lowercase letters. And these Latin letters were designed to have the same width as the katakana characters, so they'd be more visually consistent and readable alongside the Japanese. And when Unicode was introduced in 1991, these extra wide characters got their own block, known as the Fullwidth and Halfwidth forms block. Interestingly, in Vaporwave, most track titles that contain full-width characters aren't accompanied by CJK characters. Fullwidth appears to have taken on a life of its own. Some Redditors have shared alternate theories about why full-width characters are used in Vaporwave. These theories are related to the sounds of Vaporwave, slowing down samples, adding reverb, things like that. And some Vaporwave doesn't even use full-width characters to achieve this stretched out look. Sometimes text is stretched out with regular basic Latin characters and spaces. In our analysis, we can spot these by looking for text strings that are made up of about 50% spaces, mimicking the look of Fullwidth. Here's the Vaporwave bump, 50% spaces. Again, not the sort of thing you see in synthwave. Some Vaporwave artists take letter spacing to extremes. We found tracks that contain almost 90% spaces, sometimes with really cool creative spacing, like on this track, Saturday Morning. Here's a weird Unicode thing. The spacing for this track shows up properly on SoundCloud's mobile app, but in the browser, it looks like this, because HTML ignores extra white space. A solution here could be to replace Unicode space character 0020 with non-breaking space character 00A0, but that's easier said than done. Vaporwave's relationship with nostalgia is complex. One way Vaporwave toys with nostalgia is by sampling the sounds of the 80s and 90s, and some Vaporwave stops there, and some goes a level deeper by commenting on how modern corporations also elicit nostalgia from us. Today, brands will intertwine feelings for yesterday with their sales messages, sort of weaponizing nostalgia. Like, even the biggest anti-capitalist skeptic can get the feels from a well-crafted Super Bowl ad. So, baked into Vaporwave is the recognition that nostalgia is a product, and corporations are some of nostalgia's finest, most manipulative craftsmen. We see this corporate Vaporwave on albums like and we see it in text too, through the use of the trademark symbol, the registered trademark symbol, the copyright symbol, and abbreviations like Inc., Corp., LLC, which we see in track titles like We can also look to the data to see that Vaporwave uses corporate symbols way more than synthwave, with the trademark character and corp abbreviation in the lead. One of the earliest thorough long-form analyses of Vaporwave is this 2012 article by Adam Harper in Dummy Magazine, where he really hones in on these anti-capitalist themes. And in the years that followed Harper's article, some have reacted by calling this sort of Vaporwave as a commentary on capitalism analysis nonsense. One Reddit user called Harper's article super reductive and over-intellectualized. Overconfident positing of Vaporwave as this grand capitalist critique was about as pretentious as writing on the topic gets. Others have argued that the only reason people talk about Vaporwave being a commentary on capitalism is because Harper set the narrative. Reddit user PS1 says, blame Harper for thinking Far Side Virtual, an album which did have anti-capitalist and anti-consumerist themes, was the end-all be-all of Vaporwave. And the text data sheds some light on all this. Harper's article came out in the very early days of Vaporwave, in the same month that the Vaporwave subreddit was created. And at that time, the use of these corporate text symbols were at their height. As Vaporwave grew in popularity, the use of these corporate symbols and track titles faded. So, Harper wasn't wrong, but he was analyzing the genre in its infancy. One reason Vaporwave often incorporates old technology into the aesthetic could be related to what the Bandcamp blog calls the 21st century's pretensions of being unparalleled in its technological sophistication. Like in the 80s and 90s, we thought that we were at technology's peak, and now that seems so quaint. And Vaporwave plays on this. Some Vaporwave text will reference the technologies of that bygone era. And other Vaporwave text is formatted so that the tracks themselves look like technological artifacts, like the music you're listening to was lifted off an old backup tape or found on a dust-covered PC in the attic. And one of the ways this is done is with file extensions. Here are some examples of Vaporwave text being formatted to look like an old file. Let's look at the data and compare to synthwave. Vaporwave tracks are formatted to look like files 5 times more often than in synthwave, and the specific file extensions used are more likely to be ones that were popular in the 80s and 90s. For example, AVI and WMV show up more frequently than modern video formats like MP4 and MOV. One of the bigger shifts in how text was used artistically in the 80s and 90s came with the decline of the BBS, or bulletin board service, and the rise of the web. In the age of the BBS, text was monospaced, and there was a whole world of people who made amazing not just user interfaces, but full-blown art with ANSI characters. In 1993, when AOL started mailing out CDs to get people online, we shifted from doing things in the terminal to doing things in the web browser, where variable width text was more common, and ANSI art was dealt its death blow. Retro digital art shows up on Vaporwave album covers, and it's usually pixel art or stuff made in MS Paint, but ANSI and ASCII art do exist in Vaporwave. Here are some examples of Vaporwave album covers that have ANSI or ASCII art elements in their designs. And as you probably guessed, Vaporwave artists use Unicode characters from the block elements block, geometric shapes block, and miscellaneous mathematical symbols blocks to mimic ANSI art and transport listeners to the days of BBSs and late night beeps, hisses, and crackles of 56K modems. Some examples. And again, compared to synthwave, these sorts of characters appear far more frequently in Vaporwave. Okay, so this might be a better topic for another video, but there's a better Unicode block for recreating ANSI art called the symbols for legacy computing block. It was only introduced in 2020, so support for it is pretty limited. I also wanted to show you this chart to show you when these ANSI-looking characters started getting popular in Vaporwave text. What's interesting is these aren't the only characters that started gaining popularity well past Vaporwave's peak. I have a theory about this and we'll discuss in a minute. Characters that look like this belong to the mathematical alphanumeric symbols Unicode block, and while they were originally intended to be used in mathematical notation, today people use them to mimic the look of bold text, italics, monospace, and other text styles. For what it's worth, these are also some of the most popular tools on Yatext. You type the text in, copy, paste into Facebook or Twitter or whatever, and you have fancy stylized text. Here are some Vaporwave tracks that use these mathematical characters.
Ahoy, mateys! For a safe wave, be sure to stay seated with your hands, arms, feet, and legs.
And, like the ANSI-looking characters we discussed earlier, these mathematical alphanumerics started picking up steam in Vaporwave in 2018 and have yet to show signs of slowing. So, what is going on? It's time to take everything we've looked at and put it all together to get a more nuanced look at how Vaporwave has evolved from 2010 to today. For this part of the video, I'm going to pull some quotes from Van Pogum, who's a DJ who works with 80s Japanese funk, disco, and city pop, and he's been following Vaporwave since its inception. He has a few interesting blog posts that go over Vaporwave's rise and fall, and it's interesting to pit Pogum's take against the data. In the early days of Vaporwave, 2010, 2011, Vaporwave had a spirit of innovation and experimentation. Tracks posted to Bandcamp and SoundCloud under the Vaporwave genre were just beginning to trickle in. There were no Reddit communities, and as far as the text goes, there wasn't really a consistent style yet. From 2012 to 2014, we see a rise in Vaporwave interest and in artistry. Track count begins to climb. The Vaporwave subreddit is created, meaning there's now a community of listeners. On Google, people start searching for the term Vaporwave, indicating more interest in the genre, and there's more experimenting with text. We start to see a consistent text style emerge with CJK and Fullwidth. These are also the early days where the use of trademark symbols and corporate language peak, so maybe also the peak years for Vaporwave expressing its ideas related to capitalism and consumerism. 2015 to 2016, Vaporwave track count really begins to peak. Major publications like Vice and Esquire chime in to discuss whether Vaporwave is dead or not, as do plenty of Vaporwave artists. Use of corporate text symbols decline, more people start using Fullwidth characters without CJK, and use regular spaces to achieve the Fullwidth look. And this could be where the Fullwidth aesthetic starts to become its own thing, less about Japan and more about a look. Another subreddit, Vaporwave Aesthetics, is created, which is a more visual and less music-oriented community, reflecting a shift in focus to a visual look that Pogum calls a parasitic neon haze. As far as creativity goes, musically, a lot of what's produced during this time period has been described as low effort, and we see this in the use of Unicode as well. The formula for making Vaporwave text using stretched out text, sometimes with and sometimes without CJK, is established. 2017 marks the start of Vaporwave's musical decline, but not its death. At this point in time, the musical and visual components of Vaporwave seem to decouple. Van Pogum says that Vaporwave becomes all about its visual components. The Vaporwave subreddit continues to see a drop in activity, while the Vaporwave aesthetic subreddit gains popularity. On the tech side of things, we see activity that seems to mirror Vaporwave's shift to things that are more visually interesting. This is like a tiny Unicode renaissance where Vaporwave artists start to experiment again. ANSI-looking characters start to get more use, alphanumeric math characters start to get more use. These characters aren't really tied to the earlier philosophies of Vaporwave, but they're visually interesting. And finally, we arrive at the Vaporwave of today. There's a drop in interest on Google, a drop in activity on both musical and visual Vaporwave Reddit communities, and that Unicode renaissance sort of dies out, and we end up with a slightly different formula for Vaporwave text. Many Vaporwave artists have pushed back on the idea that Vaporwave is dead, but there is no denying it's not the same thing that it was in 2010. Van Pogum says that today's Vaporwave is a fractured mess, but still glued together by a supergroup of producers and scenesters who will defend it to the end. One interesting thing. While the number of tracks under the Vaporwave genre has seen a decline, tracks with the Vaporwave tag somewhere in their list of tags is growing. Artists are no longer producing music that's proper noun Vaporwave, but they're still using the word Vaporwave somewhere in their tag list to describe their music. Vaporwave is now an adjective. If you stick the word Vaporwave into a DALL-E prompt, the output is predictable. If you listen to Vaporwave, there are clear boundaries for what you can expect in terms of the Vaporwave sound, and Vaporwave text has a predictable look to it too. That's not to say that any of this is bad. I like the sound of Vaporwave, but I also like seeing artists pushing boundaries in music, in visual art, and with text. Unicode has 327 blocks, almost 150,000 characters that are ripe for more exploration. Whether that exploration happens with Vaporwave or somewhere else, who knows, but it will happen because that's what us humans do. We use language, and as we use language, it evolves. In the comments, show me your weirdest, craziest, most beautiful Unicode. And also, let me know what you think about all this. Do you agree? Is my analysis off the mark? Is Vaporwave alive and thriving? And also, are you interested in seeing more videos like this? Finally, check out yatext.com, where you can easily generate some interesting text with Unicode. There are actually going to be some more text styles dropping soon on the site, so if you want to be the first to know about those, give Yatext a follow on Twitter or Facebook. Okay, sorry, one more thing. Free idea. Hieroglyphics and Vaporwave. Not a thing yet, but it should be. So, what someone needs to do is sample sounds from mummy movies and TV shows from the 80s and 90s, like the Disney movie Under Wraps.
Hello?
And the cartoon Mummies Alive. And this episode of Pac-Man where a mummy tries to make Pac-Man reveal the location of the power forest.
Oh, look, Mama! Big baby will big diaper!
That's no big baby! That's a Pac-Mummy!
And some fruity yummy mummy cereal ads.
Hey, have a bite. It's new fruity yummy mummy cereal.
And then use DALL-E to make some Egyptian Vaporwave art and the Unicode hieroglyphics block for the track titles. Long live Tutwave.
Good-looking Sphinx. Back in a flash with the Sugar Crisp series.
Be careful, Sugarbear.